And then our fourth panelist is Dr. Jeremy Bruscotter, who is with The Ohio State University, and he'll be doing his presentation virtually.
There he is. Looks like.
Oh, I guess he can hear us. These are the pitfalls of being the first symposium of the first day of the conference. So thank you for your patience. I'm going to, so the title of this panel is Modernizing State Wildlife Management to Restore Wildlife Resiliency. But for myself, I think it's more about, it's more than just resiliency, it's about preventing extinctions. And I'm going to start our panel by talking about how the systemic problems of our current system of wildlife management in the United States, and offer some suggestions for how the system needs to change. And the focus of my talk will be on policy issues. I know this is a conference of mostly focused on science, but my talk will be, I'm not a scientist. I have a master's degree in natural resources policy and a bachelor's in biology. But I've spent the last 30 years working as a wildlife advocate in the nonprofit sector, mostly on policy issues. But my fellow panelists will delve into the values side, as well as give some specifics. Don will talk about how these issues play out in the state of Nevada. And then, well, great, now we can see me. Throughout this presentation, when I refer to hunters, which I will do quite a bit, I'm including other consumptive users of wildlife, including anglers and trappers. So hunters is shorthand for consumptive users. And I should say at the outset that this is not a presentation about hunting per se, but about the politics of wildlife management, in which hunting and hunters figure prominently, as we'll all talk about. Next slide. So
we're waiting at ACMI from that computer here. They're bringing it.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll just keep going. The slides aren't that important. So why is this topic important? Why is the topic of state wildlife management important in the United States? Because we are the only country that does not have a national biodiversity strategy. States have primary jurisdiction over most wildlife within their borders. And each state has its own set of laws, policies, and institutions. Can you all hear me? Related to wildlife. So even though each state is different, the system of wildlife management that has developed in each state is pretty much the same. Beginning in the late 1800s, state laws were enacted to stop the unregulated hunting of animals, mostly game animals. And then wildlife agencies were created to administer the laws. And then wildlife commissions were established to oversee the agencies. And funding sources for the agencies were established. And the most important of those were license fees from the sale of hunting and fishing licenses and federal grants after 1937, which we're going to talk about. And the problems with the system of state wildlife management are the same in every state as well, to a more or less degree. It's a system that was developed in large part by hunters, primarily for the benefit of hunters. And you know, it developed at a time before the word ecology was really even in use. And when animals, wild animals, were widely perceived as resources for people to use. So it's very utilitarian focused, and the system reflects that era. But it is outdated, and it's out of step with current ecological understanding, norms of democratic governance, public trust principles, and changing public attitudes. Here's my slide. You're not missing much, believe me. Bottom line, because the current system of state wildlife management is so outdated, it's entrenched, it's been captured by consumptive users, it now works against the type of conservation that probably all of us in this room think is urgently needed to protect biodiversity in the United States in the face of a mass extinction crisis and climate change. This slide I would like you to see. But anyway, what's on the slide is the IUCN's definition of conservation. So an important question has to be asked, and let me just read that definition to you. The IUCN defines conservation. So the IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. They have the word conservation in their name. The protection, care, management, and maintenance of ecosystems, habitats, wildlife species, and populations within or outside of their natural environments in order to safeguard the natural conditions for their long-term permanence. Okay, so it's very much focused on protecting nature for the long term. So an important question has to be asked: what is the purpose of the current system of state wildlife management? Is it biological conservation along those lines of the IUCN? By the way, I wanted to use the definition of conservation used by the Society for Conservation Biology, but I couldn't find one, and I'm not sure there is one. If anyone knows, please speak up. But I don't believe the Society has defined conservation. And personally, I think that's important because conservation, the word, has been co-opted by a lot of entities. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Is that the priority focus of wildlife agencies, which are on the front line of wildlife conservation in the United States? State wildlife agencies. You remember, they have primary jurisdiction over most wildlife within their borders. Or is it something else? And the evidence suggests it is something else. State wildlife agencies do a lot of things, some of which are listed on this slide, and I'll just read them to you. Enforcing hunting regulations, administering hunting and fishing license sales, providing hunter safety and education programs, recruiting more hunters and anglers, constructing and operating shooting ranges, operating fish hatcheries and stocking programs, suppressing predators to increase game populations, acquiring and managing land, improving habitat, conducting research and public education, protecting non-hunted species, and responding to complaints. So I would argue that most of those things are aimed at managing hunting and fishing more than biological conservation. In fact, I would argue that most states, the main focus of wildlife management is on producing a harvestable surplus of game animals under an agricultural model of game management as defined by Aldo Leopold in his famous book, Game Management, came out in 1933, and not the holistic protection of ecosystems and species that is needed today. And there are many examples of the discrepancy between what state wildlife agencies do and authentic conservation. I'd like to highlight a few areas. The first is that states are in the business of raising and stocking non-native species in prodigious quantities, even when those species cause harm to native species and ecosystems, simply to provide hunting and fishing opportunities. And here are just a few examples. Rainbow trout. They're native to Pacific cold water watersheds. In the United States, they're native to, Washington, Oregon, a little bit of Idaho, California. But they have been widely introduced outside their native range. They hybridize with, they compete with, or prey on native species to the extent that the IUCN has included them on their list of the 100 most invasive species in the world. I had no idea such a list existed, but it does, and rainbows are on it. But they are big business. Only a handful of states do not stock rainbow trout. Rainbow trout. Only a handful of states don't, and those are the southern states where there's no cold water waters. And they don't live long in the wild. One study found that stock trout don't survive past 1 week. These are fish that spend most of their lives in concrete tanks, swimming in circles, and then one day they're put in the wild. And then there's people with fishing lines, and there's predators, and et cetera. So as fun as it might be to catch trout, rearing and stocking millions, and that's not an exaggeration, of non-native fish annually at a cost of millions of dollars that cause ecological damage and live only a matter of days solely for the benefit of people who buy fishing licenses can hardly be called conservation. And here's, this one's the interactive part of the presentation. According to the American Fisheries Society, how many fish are stocked annually in the United States? Any guesses? Number of individuals. Half a billion, a billion? Can I get another? Can I get 1.75 billion? And many, if not most of those, are non-native species. Keystone species, such as prairie dogs, play an exceptionally important role in ecosystems.
We can grab the computer and hook it up if you want your slides.
Yeah, let's take a short break. Talk among yourselves.
I guess just...
Any questions so far?
Sorry.
I was shocked to learn that about non-native fish. I mean, it's just a huge, it's a huge undertaking of state wildlife agencies, and it really doesn't get a lot of attention, as I don't think. And, I told my brother that. He's a big fly fisherman out of Phoenix, and he said, yeah, I'd love to only catch natives, but I'll catch what's out there. He's a, catch and release, which I call harassment, but yeah, and even in New Mexico, where I'm from, we basically don't have water. We raise and release something like 14 million fish each year, most of them non-native predatory fish like rainbows. The rainbows are triploid, so they're not supposed to reproduce. Or hybridize. It's a big problem. Before they were triploid, they hybridized with all our natives, our Gila trout, our cutthroats, and so that's the big conservation challenge now, is to get rid of the hybrids. And yet we continue to release these hatchery-raised fish. We also raise walleye, which is nowhere near its native range. Yeah, and a lot of money goes into that. Keep this all in mind, because you're going to hear about how people that fund state wildlife agencies call that conservation. And so they say, we pay for conservation, ergo, we should have a say in what they do, a greater say. So I'll just continue. Keystone species such as prairie dogs. Oh, we're getting there. There we are. We're at prairie dogs. Now I can't see. Are you going to advance for me?
Yeah.
All right. All right, so I can, Yeah, prairie dogs. Oh, you need the mic. I'll stay here. So you all know that keystone species like prairie dogs play an exceptionally important role in ecosystems, and they've been eliminated from much of their range. But instead of focusing on the recovery of these important species, as might be a priority under the IUCN's definition, for example, they are unprotected in many states and allowed to be hunted, which means used for target shooting. Next slide. Predators. Given the body of research showing how important top carnivores are to ecosystems, you'd think state wildlife managers would go out of their way to protect and restore them. But the opposite is true. Where wolves have been delisted and management returned to the states, such as Wisconsin, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, they are allowed to be aggressively hunted and trapped with the goal of reducing their numbers as low as possible without triggering relisting under the Endangered Species Act. Next slide. Wildlife killing contest. I don't know if you know about these things. Who does not know what a wildlife killing contest is? I mean, you can guess, of course, but these are competitions where the contestants compete for prizes, usually money or guns, to kill as many of a certain kind of animal as possible over a few days. And Michelle's going to talk more about that, but because coyotes are unprotected in most states, they are frequently the target of these killing contests, like this one called Santa's Sleigh, which was held around Christmas time in Arizona. Arizona has since banned these contests, but they remain legal in 42 states. So, we have, next slide, please. So why aren't state wildlife agencies focused on protecting biodiversity? Well, there are a number of reasons. Legally, as I mentioned, their mandates in state statutes, essentially their marching orders, are outdated. They reflect that era when animals were seen simply as resources, and it was just a very utilitarian view of nature. And in many states, the Wildlife Agency does not even have management authority over all the species within the state. The example is in New Mexico, our Game and Fish Department only has management authority over about 60% of the vertebrate species, and virtually none of the invertebrates. Very few states have management authority over invertebrates. Culturally, agency staff are often hunters themselves and tend to identify, share the worldviews and values of hunters. And you'll often hear hunters referred to as their customers, their primary customers. Politically, hunters and increasingly the gun lobby wield significant influence over wildlife decisions. And historically, a large portion of agency revenues have come from hunters. And there's a lot more detail about this on our website, wildlifeforall.us. And it really comes down to, next slide, please. It comes down to power. Who gets to make the decisions? Whose interests are represented? Wildlife decision-making today is a bastion of anti-democracy. Most Americans do not hunt or fish. Only about 5% hunt and 9% fish. Yet the rest of the population are largely excluded from making decisions about wildlife. I mentioned these commissions. 47 states have wildlife commissions that set policy or advise their wildlife agency. Most commissioners are volunteers appointed by governors. More than 70% of them self-identify as hunters or anglers. Required qualifications vary by state, but in most states, no particular expertise is required. In some cases, you have to be a consumptive user in order to serve on the commission. And demographically, the commissioners, like hunters, tend to be older white men. You know, despite the fact that I belong to that demographic, I think it should raise a red flag any time that important policy decisions are being made by old white men. Just my opinion. Okay. So next slide, please. So the reason often given, I talked about this a little bit earlier, is about why hunters deserve a privileged position in wildlife decision-making is that they pay for conservation. Sometimes it's even said that hunting is conservation, and there may be some handouts left of an article I wrote about why hunting is not conservation and why it matters. The reason that this is said is that hunters have traditionally provided much of the revenue for state wildlife agencies through their purchase of licenses and the taxes they pay on certain items under 2 acts of Congress, Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson. And there are many holes in this argument. And I don't really have time to go into all those. But still, there's this persistent perception that hunters and anglers pay more than others for conservation and thus deserve a greater voice than non-hunters. And keep in mind, we're talking about not conservation per se, but state agency, wildlife agency revenues. And so next slide. So this is the reason that the decline in hunting that has been happening for decades is seen as an existential threat to the status quo. State wildlife agencies and their allies have responded to this perceived threat in one of 2 ways. Next slide. The first is to embrace a broader mission, new constituencies, and new funding sources. The Recovering America's Wildlife Act, how many of you have heard of that? Oh, good. RAWA, currently in Congress, would establish significant new funding for conservation of species that are not hunted. The problem is, from my perspective, is that the money would go to the same state agencies and commissions without any real accountability or requirement to provide for greater public involvement. It has passed the House. We'll see if it passes the Senate. Next slide. The alternative approach in response to this existential threat of declining funding is to double down on the status quo and try to recruit more hunters and anglers through so-called R3 efforts, recruit, retain, reactivate. Every state agency now has an R3 program, and in these programs they have found a solid ally in the gun industry whose influence over wildlife policy has grown steadily with a surge in gun sales over the past 20 years. And currently, only about less than 25% of guns that are purchased in the U.S. today are purchased for hunting. The rest are not. They're purchased for self-defense or target shooting or what have you, but not hunting. And so these are some screenshots from the website of the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which bills itself as the Firearm Industry Trade Association. This foundation has spent millions on R3 efforts, like, next slide. Oh, just hit the advance button. Yeah. They've spent millions on these R3 efforts, like figuring out how to get children who like to target shoot to switch to live targets. And this is from their website. So it is unclear which of these directions will prevail, but R3 efforts received a serious boost when Congress okay. These R3 efforts got a serious boost from Congress in 2019 when they amended the Pittman-Robertson Act to allow Pittman-Robertson funds to be used by states and nonprofits like NSSF for R3 efforts, and which are now defined to include encouraging people to buy guns and take up target shooting at a time when gun violence in the United States is at a record high. Your tax dollars are going to encourage people to buy guns. Okay, next slide. So there's been a growing awareness within the wildlife advocacy community about the problems with state wildlife management. And in 2021, we launched a national campaign, and it's coordinated by my organization, Wildlife for All, to reform state wildlife to be more ecologically focused, democratic, and just. And we now have about 65 organizations in 30 states as members. Policy goals include modernizing state laws, the wildlife mandates, and the authority to align those with public trust principles essentially to protect all species for all people. And the elements of that are government has a duty as the trustee of this public trust to protect the trust for beneficiaries present and future. All people, not just hunters, are beneficiaries, and all species, not just game species, are the trust. And in fact, I would argue that all life is the beneficiary as well. Second policy goal is to reform commissions. Our preference would be to abolish them because they really serve no useful purpose, I would say. But that's a heavy political lift, so barring that, our goal is to change state laws that restrict who can serve on commissions, to professionalize them, to establish minimum standards, to serve on a commission, and ensure that they broadly represent the public interest in wildlife. Another policy goal is to establish new funding sources that are broadly based, because if wildlife's a public trust, we should all pay for it, right? That are not tied, these funding sources are not tied to license or gun sales. And then those are some specific policy goals, but our overarching goal is to change the paradigm of wildlife management in the U.S. before it's too late. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kevin. You did a great job at laying the foundation of the problem. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem. I can't start any presentation without a call out to the crises that we're living in right now. But I'm going to try and present a little bit more of a positive future. So Kevin talked a little bit about some of the reform goals that we have in the immediate future. What I'm going to talk about is, advancing that vision even a little bit further. Can you pull up my presentation? It's loot. Sorry. And I'm speaking for myself and my co-author, Dr. Francisco Santiago Avila, who couldn't be here. He's in Madison, Wisconsin, and he's our science and conservation manager at Project Coyote. Awesome. Next slide. So the crisis. I have to be a little bit of a Debbie Downer at the beginning. 400 years. That's how long we as white settlers mostly, have been degrading ecosystems in North America by hunting, trapping, logging, grazing, burning, mining, draining, building, sprawling, trawling, damming, diverting, pumping, and poisoning. 400 years of that. That's where we're at today. So next slide. We're living in the age of the Anthropocene, the age dominated by humans. We have climate change. We have mass extinction. I think one of the greatest challenges of the age that we live in, the Anthropocene, is to learn how to coexist with others, however you define others. So that's coexisting with each other, that's coexisting among disagreement, and that's coexisting with non-human animals. So we really need to find ways to share and protect this hot, hungry, and crowded world that we're living in. Next slide. So I think one of the key questions we have to be asking right now when we're talking about wildlife governance is, can the current wildlife decision-making structures address the plight of non-human animals? Are we doing that right now? And if not, how can we do better? Next slide. I would say right now, we are not addressing the plight of non-human animals in our decision-making about wildlife. This is the result of a wildlife killing contest, which Kevin defined. They're allowed in most of the states in the U.S., other than the 8 states that we as advocates and a community of advocates has worked to ban state by state, and we've got federal legislation to ban them across the country on federal public lands. But they're still occurring all the time, mostly through the winter, but they can happen day or night, any time of year, basically anywhere in your backyard. And so the fact that this exists, and this is the implications of a wildlife killing contest. This happens in one weekend, and this is one participant of many. Species subject to no bag limits. So coyotes, foxes, bobcats, many species have no regulations, and that's our current wildlife structure. That's the decision making that results in this. This doesn't look like conservation, and this doesn't look like the kind of decisions I want to see. And again, don't forget, 400 years of exploitation have led to this. Some other examples of why our current wildlife structures are failing wildlife. Trapping allowed that jeopardizes not just wildlife populations, but also human safety and the safety of companion animals recreating on public lands. Grazing on public lands, also another thing. Not good for any habitat to have non-native cows overgrazing places, especially across the American West where we're experiencing unprecedented drought. They're saying we shouldn't even be calling it drought because it's the new normal. So we can't keep cows on public lands, and yet we have wildlife governance structures that allow for that. Implementation of non-lethal in so many contexts that we know does not work to prevent conflict and may be even counterproductive in increasing conflict in certain places. Again, wildlife current governance allows for these sort of things. Just here in Nevada, outside Reno, in lots of places, wild horses are being rounded up. Pregnant mares and newborn foals are being chased with helicopters. This is, again, wildlife management. And regardless of how you feel about whether or not burros and wild horses should be on the landscape, I think, just go on Instagram and see American Wild Horse Campaign and see the videos. The plight of non-human animals is not being considered in that management. So even today, only human life and welfare is seen as the basis of making any sort of political action or legal action. If you have an egregious attack on wildlife or on the environment, you still have to have standing declarants that are humans in a lawsuit. So you always have to bring it back to human claims. The claims of nature, the claims of the environment, of wildlife are not considered. There are no institutional statutes or guidelines for considering and balancing human and non-human claims. Next slide. So this current structure and the focus on populations that Kevin referenced, this is the current decision-making. If it doesn't lead to potential extinction of species, often we don't get any protection. So this is what leads to what Freya Matthews calls ecologies of the minimal. So she states, the goal of biodiversity conservation is to assure viability rather than abundance. This results in a tendency towards ecology of the minimal, which is compatible with large-scale human exploitation. So this focus, not on individuals, this focus on populations, even a focus on biodiversity as a whole or sustainability as a vague notion, leads to these issues. The individual's intrinsic value is not considered. Cue the insect apocalypse, the bird apocalypse, all the things you're reading about once abundant species now in steep decline. And we all watch this happen because, well, they're not endangered yet. Think pinyon jays, think wolves, think lightning bugs, all the bugs that used to hit your windshield when you drive. It's not happening as much. And we're seeing that happen and we're ignoring it. Next slide. So how do we move to coexistence? In other words, how would we support mutual flourishing of the natural world? Well, it would take respect, and it would take a justice framework, a multi-species justice framework, and a social justice issue, really. It would take decision-making structures that allow for ethical frameworks that should be brought into decision-making. So a couple potential strategies of how this might look. Next slide. We've got to truly democratize wildlife decision-making. So we're in this wave of democracies being lost across the globe. They're calling it potentially the third wave of lost democracies. But our wildlife governance structures have never been very democratic, as Kevin mentioned. So we've got to democratize, and we've got to promote pluralist ethical dialogue and analysis. It has to be intersectional, against all oppressions. That means racist, classist, xenophobic, gender-biased, heterosexist, ableist, anthropocentric. All of those things need to be addressed. So we have to have diverse decision-making bodies listening to diverse constituent voices. That's one of the first things. So these kids should have a say. And not just future generations, but all life. Next slide, please. So we've got to talk about how we might represent non-human claims in a decision-making framework. And this could look like proxies for non-humans or more than humans. This could be trustee advocates for different groups or classes of animals. There's some big questions about the danger of homogenizing various claims or interests, which my next quote will kind of get into. But we've got to ask questions about what these trustee advocates would do, how they would act, what qualities, traits, or knowledge they might have. We can look to India and New Zealand and Ecuador for what they're doing with the rights of rivers or the rights of nature generally. Next slide. So I wasn't even talking about this issue. I was talking about, with a friend, a progressive rancher in Mendocino County, about kind of all the problems we're dealing with and how we promote non-lethal wildlife management in places like where he ranches. And he started on this tangent. This is from an email. I asked him if I could pull this, because this just, I think, is really illustrates this notion of proxies or trustee advocates and how there might be some challenges and complexities. So he said, until then, and even likely after, once the mosquitoes have tried to have their say, we're going to have to interpret the turtle's vote together, and in some cases weigh that of the western pond turtle against the red-eared slider. But I think that we need to be careful about how we assign voices to the more than human world. Next slide. He continued, should we assume that the elk, for example, share our same suicidal views on population growth, or might they take the long view? Might there be a few elk who, having been inspired by that video about the wolves of Yellowstone, vote yes to the hunt? So thinking about the claims of non-human animals will mean that we really have to consider our own anthropocentric views. And I don't mean to vilify anthropocentrism. It can lead to a healthy empathy. So it's just, noting the complexities and challenges of this vision that I'm trying to offer. Next slide. So obviously, there are lots of complexities, but what could this new approach look like? Well, first, we need to remove the concept of stakeholders, which works to homogenize interests and against the urgency of animal claims in favor of sometimes trivial human claims, like recreation or tradition. May not always be trivial, but in some instances, it might be. Instead, a claims-driven process that considers non-human individuals and the collective claims and their urgency relative to some human interests would be a great start. So representation within such processes could be inclusive, should be inclusive, democratic, and non-anthropocentric to the extent possible. Second, ethics needs to be incorporated alongside science. So science is just a tool. It can tell us the consequences of our actions. It can say, you can hunt 30% of this wolf population and they're not going to go extinct. But it doesn't tell us if we ought to do that. It doesn't say you should do that. It just says, if you do this within a range of uncertainty, here are the expected outcomes. So science is like a hammer. It can be life-affirming, it can help build shelter, or it can take life. It only tells us the consequences, and without ethical analysis and deliberation, science falls short. So conservation is at its core a value-laden decision. It's not purely biological. So policies, what would this look like? Again, turning to the vision of governance structure. Policies could go through not only scientific, but ethical examination. So you would fact check your potential policy, but you would also value check it by clarifying the values reflected in different positions and their resulting policies. Ethical analysis on both process and outcome of management proposals is needed. So you'd ask questions like, what values are being promoted through policy implementation from different ethical perspectives? What is being prioritized? How do those values align with those of the public and different groups, including animals? It could include ethical training and workshops included in other scientific trainings that are not usually addressed. So topics like ethology, animal behavior, detailing internal and social traits in the lives of non-human animals would be super helpful on this front. Next slide. And this is my last slide. So the last thing we've got to consider when we're talking about moving towards more equitable and just decision-making is considering the precautionary principle. So this is not just simply a rationale for action in the face of scientific uncertainty. It's a principle of forecaring, and it has implications for the use of science in undertaking action for the common good. It seeks to foresee, forewarn, and forestall harm as the well-being of individual humans and non-humans, as well as ecological and social communities. So you're thinking about individuals, you're thinking about populations, you're thinking about ecosystems, all of those levels at once. It's not a way to sidestep complex questions of science or ethics and thereby resolve debate. So debate's still going to be there, and that's a healthy, important part of democratic processes. It is instead a powerful tool for thinking through and weighing how one ought to respond in the light of ethical and scientific complexities at hand. And I'm pulling very almost direct quotes from my co-author, Dr. Fran, and his colleagues, as they so eloquently explained in a 2019 study. So the precautionary principle demands ethical thinking and analysis and goes right along with these other elements of governance change that I've talked about. Next slide. This is really my last slide. So what I've laid out here is a future vision of inclusivity of both humans and all humans, I should say. So Kevin talked about how there are many humans whose claims are not being considered, and it's mostly been a certain contingent of consumptive users. So inclusivity of both humans and non-humans in new moral communities and sustainable socio-ecological systems where policy and practice is decided through a just process. Maybe this sounds simple, but it's radically different from the status quo. So this is, I think, a pretty ambitious future vision. And so we can all contribute to this vision. You're already doing it. You're here, you're listening, you're learning, you're talking, and that's the first step. And then we have to raise our voices. We have to make space for other voices in governance structures and for the claims of others, and we have to call for explicit ethical analysis and justice in current governance structures. And with that, I thank you all.
The next one's the virtual Zoom. You should let him know that it's live now.
Yeah.
You're on, Jeremy.
Hey, so, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Sorry, I was having trouble hearing you. I'm not sure if you're talking in the microphone there toward the end. So apologize for that transition. So we've been talking a little bit about what's being advocated and why governance reform and agency reform is important. So I want to back up a little bit and talk about some of the social and ecological changes that are underway. Michelle's dealt with some of the ecological change. I want to talk a little bit about the social side of this and walk you through some of the social changes that are afoot and why we think those justify agency change as well. So thank you all. And on behalf of my my co-author, Leanne Sullivan, thanks for being here. And I'm sorry for not joining you in person. So briefly, when we tell the story of conservation in the United States, we do so through the eyes of those who held power during the late 19th and early 20th century. And these were, of course, white men of privilege. Chief among them, at least in terms of power, was Theodore Roosevelt, who became the 26th president of the United States in 1901. And the way we tell the story, these men of privilege laid a foundation for a system of conservation that's largely still in place today. And the overarching question I hope to raise today simply is that system still relevant? The story of how the early conservation movement started is relatively straightforward. By the time Roosevelt took office, the primary problem, overutilization of resources, had become painfully obvious. Indeed, that year in 1901 marked the killing of the last wild passenger pigeon, a species once numbering in the millions, had been relentlessly killed both to protect crops and as a source of cheap food. And passenger pigeons were not anomalous in this regard. So bison, also once numbering in the millions, had been reduced to a few remnant populations by the late 1880s, in no small part because doing so was of strategic advantage to the United States government's efforts to subdue native tribes. It's really hard to overstate the scope of the destruction. So take my home state of Ohio, for example. By the late 1880s, all land mammals with an average body mass greater than 10 kilograms have been completely eradicated from the state. We've since reintroduced white-tailed deer, so congrats. Just a few years after his inauguration in a meeting of the Society of American Foresters, Roosevelt appealed to those gathered, arguing, "Your attention must be directed to the preservation of forests, not as an end in itself, but as a means of preserving the prosperity of the nation." And this quote is really emblematic of how conservation efforts were justified at that time, that is, by appealing to human self-interest or anthropocentrism. And the systems of conservation we created reflected the desire to make nature produce things people valued. So when Aldo Leopold defined game management as the art of making land produce sustained annual crops of wild games for recreational use, he was talking about making things that people valued. And by the time Leopold wrote Game Management, much of our institutional infrastructure in the modern system of conservation had begun to take shape, including the establishment of state agencies charged with the management of fish and wildlife and commissions to make policy decisions. One of the most important developments was the passage of the Pittman-Robertson Act that Kevin alluded to. This is an excise tax on firearms. It established a system for dispersing these funds to states for state-based wildlife conservation efforts. The act also tied those funds explicitly to hunting license sales, creating an incentive for agencies to promote hunting in order to access more of those funds. In this way, our system of wildlife conservation was tied to the production of hunting opportunity. However, the social and ecological changes over the past century are increasingly challenging that system of conservation. So what's changed and why do we think this is problematic? So again, Kevin mentioned this, from the perspective of agencies, a chief concern really is the long-term decline in participation in traditional types of wildlife-associated recreation, that is hunting, trapping, and fishing. These declines are often characterized as direct threats, as the quote here from the Congressional Sportsman Caucus. However, the decline in hunters may be a symptom of broader social changes that are afoot, changes that have resulted in a shift in the way people perceive and value wild animals. To better understand this shift, I'm going to briefly outline a recent project that sought to characterize America's wildlife values. The study, which was led by Mike Manfredo and Tara Thiel out of Colorado State University, collected data via surveys on more than 44,000 Americans with 50 samples, or samples in all 50 states. So first, a bit about theory and jargon. So historically, wildlife in the United States tended to be viewed in narrowly utilitarian terms. They were either resources or impediments to obtaining resources to be used by humans. Therefore, their interests, when considered at all, were subordinate to human interest. And we call this orientation domination. Culturally, domination is expressed in the traditional religious values of early Protestant Americans via Genesis, which gives humans dominion over the earth and every living thing, as well as doctrines of the time, such as manifest destiny. However, the changes associated with modernization helped catalyze a shift in our collective thinking about wildlife that we call mutualism. In contrast to domination ideology, mutualism views wild animals in more egalitarian terms, whereby wildlife are morally relevant members of a broader social community, deserving of care, compassion, and fair treatment. To better understand how modernization is affecting how Americans view wildlife, we created a survey instrument that measures these two orientations, mutualism and domination, and allows us to place individuals along corresponding continua. When we overlay these two continua, it allows us to classify people into one of four groups. So people who are low in mutualism and high in domination, we call traditionalists. Those high in both mutualism and domination, we call pluralists. Low in both, we refer to as distanced. And those high in mutualism but low in domination, we refer to as mutualists. So first, we compared data from the 2018 efforts to data collected back in 2004. And consistent with our theory, we found that the proportion of mutualists is increasing while the proportion of traditionalists is decreasing. We also found that the three indicators of modernization hypothesized to bring about value shift, increasing education, urbanization, and income, all were significantly and positively related with the proportion of mutualists at the state level. This study also included a separate survey of nearly 10,000 employees of 28 state fish and wildlife agencies. This is Leanne Sullivan's work, by the way. The agency survey was designed in part to make comparisons between the values of agency personnel and their constituents. So what did that survey find? This figure shows the proportion of the American public that can be classified into each value type. Mutualists are the most prevalent at just over a third of the population, followed by traditionalists, slightly less prevalent, then pluralists, and finally distance respondents. But we believe state agencies would be different from the general public, at least in part because the myriad ways in which domination is embedded in the culture and mission of state wildlife agencies and the American hunting culture more broadly. So how did agency personnel compare? Results support the general hypothesis. Agency personnel were far more likely to hold strong domination values and less likely to hold strong mutualist values. What was truly surprising, though, is the magnitude of the difference. So agency personnel were more than twice as likely to be classified as traditionalists, while members of the general public were more than 4 times as likely to be classified as mutualists. But this isn't even the most interesting finding. So that comes in response to a single open-ended question that simply asked, what, if any, other words would you use to describe your agency? Answers to that question yielded 263 unique references to the word politics. In fact, it was the 3rd most common word offered in response to the question, following agency and management. So according to Leanne, whose dissertation was based on this data, in digging deeper, it became quickly clear that it wasn't that agency personnel viewed their agencies as political, which of course they are, but rather that they saw their work as interrupted by politics in really problematic ways. So, and to give you a little bit of a sense of what that looked like, Leanne has given us some quotes that I've listed here over on the right side. So to understand a bit more about the frustrations, we need to provide a little bit of context about how policy decisions are generally made in agencies. So I'll use my state of Ohio to briefly illustrate. As in all states, the executive branch in Ohio houses numerous administrative agencies, one of which is the Department of Natural Resources. That department has 11 divisions, including the Division of Wildlife. Many decisions about wildlife are made by the chief of the division, who's a political appointee. However, numerous of these decisions are relegated to the Ohio Wildlife Council, which is an 8-member board that has approval authority over these rules and regulations. So nearly all states have equivalent decision-making bodies. Kevin talked about this a little bit already. They're there really to provide citizens with a degree of oversight and as a means of legitimizing agency policies. So knowing that these decision-making bodies wield the power that they wield, my colleagues and I recently sought to characterize the members of DMBs. Given the strong ties between agencies and the hunting culture, we were particularly interested in how many of these positions were held by men and sports persons. We used publicly available data to characterize this and classified them by the states that they came from, whether or not they were strongly traditionalist or strongly mutualist. As we hypothesized, the decision-making bodies tended to be comprised mostly of men and sports persons. More than 4 in 5 occupants of DMBs were male. More than 2 in 3 self-identified as sports persons. And I should emphasize that the latter number is a minimum estimate, as individuals were only coded as sports persons when they were specifically described as such in publicly available biographies. So interestingly, the composition of DMBs did not differ between predominantly traditionalist and predominantly mutualist states, meaning that the shift in values that is now underway toward mutualism does not appear to be affecting the composition of those decision-making bodies. So our findings provide some additional insight into why employees of agencies complained about politics and public involvement in the agency processes. So that is, given the biases of agency personnel toward those with traditionalist values and decision-making bodies towards sportsmen who tend to share those traditionalist values, we should anticipate more political pushback from the public in states where public values and agency values diverge, and more resistance to public involvement from agency professionals. For evidence of the latter, we turn back to Leanne's work. In this figure, the horizontal axis depicts the gap in values between agency personnel and the public, with higher values to the right representing greater divergence between the public and the agency. The vertical axis shows the percentage of agency employees that support the involvement of, quote, paying customers, aka sportsmen, in orange, and the general public in blue. And what we can see pretty clearly is that as the values gap increases, agency employees become more reluctant to involve the public. Presumably, this is because they view the public as having opinions about policy that are less likely to be in accord with traditionalist agency values. So where do we go from here? To answer that question, I'd like to ask you to imagine for a moment life in the late 19th century at the time the first state wildlife agencies began to emerge. It was imagine a life of a homesteader in the Western territories of the United States without running water, electricity, or a phone, without cars or well-maintained roads, a life without grocery stores, refrigeration, or air conditioning, or any of the things that we take for advantage, a life without a social safety net provided by modern welfare programs. So in that time, the environment was a hostile place from which people sought to carve out an existence. In this environment, animals were first and foremost our tools, they were our food, and they were at least occasionally threats to our survival. It's hard to overstate just how different social conditions are today, but how should these changes affect state wildlife conservation efforts? Recently, some colleagues and I put this question to more than 3,000 residents of 8 eastern states. Specifically, we asked residents to rank 5 priorities for state wildlife agencies. And what did we find? So this figure shows the mean priority rank of 5 agency activities separated by generational cohort along the horizontal axis. So 1 is the highest priority, 5 is the lowest, so smaller bars are a good thing, means it was emphasized. So we found that respondents across all cohorts ranked the restoration of extinct or imperiled species as the highest priority for agencies. In contrast, efforts to increase opportunities to hunt and trap was given the lowest priority ranking. Moreover, restoration was ranked higher by younger as opposed to older generational cohorts. These data suggest that current efforts to recruit, retain, and reactivate hunters that Kevin talked about might be misplaced. So returning to the question I originally posed, that is our system of wildlife conservation still relevant? I would argue that the true challenge agencies face now is how to adapt their structures and activities to appeal to a new generation of conservationists, a generation that increasingly recognizes wildlife as morally relevant and prioritizes activities such as restoration and habitat management over provisioning of recreational hunting opportunities. I think only time will tell if agencies are capable of making that transition. So with that, I'd like to thank an absolutely fabulous list of colleagues and collaborators who worked on this research. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. And I'll just note, if anybody's talking, I cannot hear you.
I think we want to keep it going so he can participate in the Q&A afterwards, yeah?
Well, yeah.
If we have time for Q&A.
I was waiting for my PowerPoint to come up. I'm the local person, in case, for those of you who came late. I was going to talk briefly about the Nevada Board of Wildlife Commissioners, which is kind of a local example of what we've been talking about generally.
Jeremy can't hear you. He probably doesn't even know the session's still going. Somebody wants to speak on the microphone, you can tell him.
Yeah, and the problem with that is that the way I did my PowerPoint, I can't see, and I need to see the screen, so I have a little issue.
Jeremy, if you can hear me, we're going to take Q&A at the end, but Don's going to walk around the room and give his presentation.
Oh, there we go. I'm the one that's supposed to bring the pretty pictures, by the way. Can we start from the beginning? The far left hand. The slideshow. If you go to slideshow up on top and then move far left, you start from the beginning. Yeah, thank you for that. So a brief, given the time we have, this is quick, and I'm just going to talk about simple demographics. I'm not going to get into any of the policy or management issues that concern us about the Nevada Board of Wildlife Commissioners. This is just going to be a very brief demographic display of why some of us in the state think the Wildlife Commission needs to be reformed, that it doesn't represent a fair and democratic management system at this point in time. So next click. And next click. Nevada has a public trust doctrine statute, the little peewee one. It basically says wildlife in this state belongs to everybody. It's not a private game reserve for hunters, doesn't belong to the Wildlife Commission. It's a public resource, a public asset, however you view it. Next click. And it says that if it's properly taken care of, it does good things for everybody and wildlife. And the Wildlife Commission are the trustees of this public trust asset. By the way, wildlife is a little bit slow to the party in terms of being included under the public trust doctrine in this country, but it is starting to happen. Next click. And the next click. The Nevada Wildlife Commission actually started out in 1877 as the Nevada Fish Commission with 3 people. Next click. In 1917, it was renamed the Fish and Game Commission, still with 3 members. Next click. In 1947, it expanded to 17 members, and coincidentally, that was the first commission meeting with that group that I ever attended in about 1975, when there were about 12 or 13 guys in a little room when I walked in. Next click. In 1979, the numbers were reduced to 7, and it was renamed to the Nevada Board of Wildlife Commissioners. There was also a conservation chair or seat at the commission that was created then, something new, and it hadn't been there before and still continues to this day. Next click. And then in '89, the commission expanded to 9 members, which is the case today. Next click. And the next click. The commission in this state is a political appointed group by the governor. There is no Senate confirmation. Next click. And currently comprised of 5, I'll just use the word hunters, 1 rancher, 1 farmer, 1 conservationist, and 1 member of the general public. And the way the seats are, there are no particular requirements to be appointed. You don't have to have a high school education. You don't have to have a driver's license, no college degree, nothing. Except that the 5 hunters have to have had a hunting or a fishing license 3 of the last 4 years. So the way these seats are currently distributed, 3 belong to Clark County, which is Las Vegas. The 2 licensees and the general public member. 3 belong in the Reno area, which are 2 licensees and the conservationist. And then the rural counties get 3. They get the rancher, the farmer, and 1 licensee. Next click. And as I've already mentioned, no qualifications required except for the licensure. And also the governor cannot remove a commissioner. If one governor appoints a commissioner to, and the next governor comes in and doesn't like them, nothing can be done about it unless the commissioner commits some act which would give cause for removal. Otherwise, once you're on the commission, you're there for 3 years and nobody can do anything about it, even if your performance is questionable. Next click. Can we click it again? There we go. We're going to talk population versus hunting licenses for a minute. Next click. Nevada has 17 counties. The 4 big ones, Clark, which is Las Vegas, Washoe, which is Reno, and then Carson and Douglas, which are just south of here, contain just short of 3 million citizens. The next click. The 13 rural counties in Nevada contain just short of 250,000 folks. And the next click. Well, anyway, so the state population, 3.2 million and change versus the next click, which is 70,000 resident hunting licenses per year. Now, that number prior to the COVID event ran about 50,000 resident hunting licenses per year. But with COVID, interestingly, it kicked up the number by about 20,000. I don't know if that's still the case today. But anyway, assuming that's the case, if we divide the big number into the little number, we get, what's the next click? The next click, we get 2%. So in this state, resident hunting license sales and hunters represent 2% of the state's population, yet they have 7 seats out of 9 on the Wildlife Commission. So hunters have a stranglehold on wildlife management in this state that in no way, shape, or form fits this kind of demographic. Let's do the next click. You know something. Let's go to the next click, since this has already been touched on. The only thing I want to show you about that value study is this pie chart. This is Nevada's respondent pie chart. There were about 1,200 Nevadans that responded to this value survey you've already heard about. 22% of Nevadans that responded were traditionalists. I think we all know what that means. 44% were mutualists, people like me. And interestingly, the mutualist value here in Nevada is second only to California. California has a mutualist value a couple points above us, but we're number 2 in the country in terms of mutualists. Then the pluralists are 19%. I was not sure what a pluralist was. You can go either way depending on the situation, but one of the wildlife department guys told me that he's a deer hunter, but he feeds birds and photographs birds and wildlife, so he considers himself a pluralist. So I thought, well, yeah, seems like a reasonable definition. And then, of course, we have the classic 15% of our population that doesn't just give a crap about anything. But that's pretty standard. That's not a new finding. So that's our distribution here in Nevada. Now, if you were to, well, we already heard that the agency personnel, including here in Nevada, took the survey, and the Wildlife Department personnel are 65% traditionalists by the way the values were rated. I don't think the Wildlife Commission participated in that, but I'm quite sure the 65% figure would probably fit them quite well, too. So, next click. All right, so here's sort of where the rubber hits the road. This is Nevada-specific data gathered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Census Bureau that's periodically updated. It's user data. We were to have an update in 2016, but politics got in the way. The Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies didn't like the way the numbers were going, and they hired a private polling organization to dispute the methodology. And then Trump got elected and all of that happened, and so we have not had updated user data since 2011. So we'll use what we have. On the left-hand side, over here, we have the numbers of anglers and hunters for the years 2001, 2006, 2011. The dark green is hunters numbers, lighter green anglers. In the center, the bars represent wildlife watchers, for some reason categorized around home and away from home, but it's for the same 3 years. It's fairly easy to see that wildlife watchers in numbers cast a considerable shadow over the consumptive users. And then on the far right, we have the economics of the situation. And the dark green represents anglers, the mid-green hunters, and the palest column of all represents wildlife watchers. And that has to do with economic impact in the state of Nevada. So although we don't have our 2016 data that we were hoping for, I don't think it's likely that that trend that you see, particularly on the far right, is likely to be reversed. I think we can all see where things are going, and it's not going back to a traditionalist point of view about wildlife management. So next slide. Okay, so next click. Another click. There we go. So what we're considering, and just sort of getting the ball rolling, is what to do about this non-democratic, unfair management system we have with the current Board of Wildlife Commissioners. And one of the things we're talking about now with legislators is whether we should have an interim study committee, which seems to have some acceptance from legislators and the governor's office, where the whole system would be examined. That is, the Department of Wildlife, the state agency, and the commission, which is the other part, and that we would look into both, since hunters have plenty of complaints about the Department of Wildlife, and we're concerned about the commission, so everybody would have their say. So if that's the case, then we would hope that something useful in the way of recommendations would surface from the interim study committee. Next click. There was talk about adding an indigenous person to one of the 9 commission seats. That was a concern of one of the prominent legislators, and we discussed that. Currently, it's not in favor, I think, because it was thought that that would do nothing to change the culture of the commission in terms of hunter domination and so on. So currently, that's not under active consideration. Next click. Here's my favorite. I'd like to get rid of it. I don't see a need for a wildlife commission anymore. The department can do everything that's needed. There's no requirement to have a wildlife commission for the agency to get the Pittman-Robertson monies and the Dingell-Johnson monies. And the commission certainly does not represent the demographics of the public, as we've already seen with my simple demographic data that I've presented. But that's a heavy lift, as Kevin has already mentioned. The governor loves to appoint people to commissions. And if the commission went away, there would be 9 appointments the governor would no longer have to make. So it's a big deal. Next click. Some talk about making it advisory, but there aren't very many advisory commissions around the country. And if a rulemaking commission is not useful, as this one is, how would an advisory committee be any better? So that's it. That's where things stand. We're early in the process of trying to reform the commission, but it is underway, and it's something we think is reasonable to do. So with that, I'll quit, and we've got a little time for Q&A.
Questions? Yeah.
So I am wondering about, well, first of all, I really appreciate the discussion about changing values and all of that. I think that's crucial and necessary and all that, but at the same time, I've been around long enough to realize that certain other things talk very loudly, including dollars. So if you follow the money, as I think you briefly alluded to, the money that makes its way to states can be traced back largely to hunting and fishing license fees, which must go to the states under the Pittman-Robertson Dingell-Johnson Act in order to get the federal excise tax. So to increase dollars for non-game wildlife, there's been some efforts right now. The bill is to just ask Congress for more money, just like give us money. Previously, it was to sort of harness the same idea of creating an excise tax on wildlife watchers, which the slide showed that demographic is increasing pretty dramatically. So I'm wondering, in trying to change the dollar flow a little bit, has that idea of a federal excise tax on wildlife watching equipment, which used to be, I mean, there was a whole campaign for that for quite a few years, but that seems to have gone away. Is that the case sort of permanently? And are we now just kind of going on to Congress give us money, or what other sorts of non-game funding sources are we really looking at?
Okay. Well, as far as a backpack tax, that's often been discussed. I don't know if that's what you're alluding to, but the outdoor recreation industry is opposed to that. you know, and I would argue rightly so, because the whole idea of a user pay model, like, again, is premised on the idea that certain people have a greater stake in wildlife than others because they somehow use wildlife, whether it's, you know, going out and shooting it or putting on a backpack and going out and maybe seeing it. And my response is kind of glibly that, well, maybe we ought to just tax airline passengers because they might see some birds when they're flying. You know, it's just like accidental sort of experience. But I think the backpack tax is a non-starter. The Recovery in America's Wildlife Act is, I mean, they've looked at various sources, but it would be a dedicated funding stream, I believe. It would not require a year-to-year appropriation from Congress. And I think the current discussion is to, is this something you know about? You covered. Oh, okay. I think the current bill is to utilize or close loopholes in conservation easements, and that somehow would generate, I don't really understand it, but that would generate a significant amount of money. Prior to that, it was going to be based on federal, you know, royalties on offshore oil and gas, but I don't think that's in the mix anymore.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is there are already inequalities in access to outdoor gear and to the outdoor sphere. So there are probably some ethical implications of backpack taxes as well. But I was at a conference and we were talking about this, and they mentioned, have you looked at what PetSmart Charities does? They, you know, just from the voluntary donations at the checkout counter of PetSmart, that's the biggest funding for shelter animals, for dogs and cats. It's a huge pot of money. So if we could do the same thing at Patagonia and REI, that could be a huge pot of money that's voluntary, gets rid of some of these problems that we've currently had. So that's something we should be talking about. I do think money talks, and that's going to be really important. Do you want to add anything? Do you want to move on to the next question?
Yes.
I should stay over there. Yeah.
Well, just following up from that idea, I mean, some states have been successful in generating additional taxes to fund non-game. And I'm just curious, in those states, and some of them that analysis, like, are there boards, are they more diverse and more representative? For those states that have, you know, generated additional non-game funding sources?
Can you speak? Yeah.
That's it. So the question was, so for states that have diversified their funding sources for wildlife conservation, are the boards and the commissions in those states more diverse as well? Is that the question? And I've wondered about that myself, and I looked at Missouri, because Missouri is often held up as the poster child of diversified funding, because they got a sales tax, general sales tax, dedicated to conservation passed you know, a long time ago. So their conservation department gets a lot of money from the general public. But they are overseen by a 4-person commission, I forget what it's called, and 3 of the 4 members are consumptive users. And my hunter friend pointed out, well, you know, a lot of people hunt in Missouri, so it's kind of representative, but it's not that representative. But that's a good research question that I wish someone would look into to see if there's a cause and effect relationship between diversified funding and broader representation on commissions, because maybe it just hasn't had enough time to happen. But Missouri's had that sales tax in place for a long time. The problem is the governors appoint these members, and most governors still think, even Democratic governors, think that wildlife is the special purview of hunters, and that's what needs to change.
We should no. Does Jeremy want to add anything?
Oh, yeah. Jeremy, do you have anything to add?
Not really. No, I think you're right. The commissions need to change, but the appointment of commissions is done. I mean, everything that's done by these agencies is is run through, through some legal framework, right? It's, and that includes the appointment of commissioners. So if the laws that require people to be of a certain ilk to sit on those commissions don't change, then clearly the appointments aren't going to shift. So maybe that takes time. I don't know.
Yeah. So how do we get to the 5 questions that are in the Q&A? Okay.
Go ahead and take them first.
And you had a question too, right? I'm sorry. So first you, and then we'll figure out what's on. Yes. Yeah, Kevin.
It's interesting to hear about the fishery, and I heard that there are non-native fish species in the state, and most people really want to fish the non-native. And what are the most common non-native species that local people want to fish? And are there any potential impact to the ecosystem of it?
So the question is, what are the favorite, most popular non-native stocked fishes that people like to fish for? I would say rainbow trout for sure. The salmonids, the trout. So the rainbows are, and just depending on what part of the country you are in, rainbows, brooks, and browns. Browns are not native to North America at all, and they're extremely have a heavy, harmful impact on native North American ecosystems. But those are the big ones. And just depends on what part of the country you're in. Some places, the catfish are non-native, or the bass. The bass are a big one too. Question?
So, I guess the first part is a comment, which is, I'm a hunter. If you take hunter's ed, which you're required to have a license, they're extremely not scientific about their, or at least they're scientifically not modern, about what they teach. So they teach that predator control and population management are sort of like key justified factors for hunting. So I guess I'm curious if you guys have looked at hunter's ed classes. I know the NRA actually sponsors and provides a number of those. So that's sort of more of a comment and a potential area for research. My question is, have you all looked at the effect of class in some of this research? I know for the rural poor, hunting is actually a really important source of food, and I'm curious, whether thinking about sort of that dimension in addition to some of the other social aspects you've considered, if you've looked at that.
That might be one for Jeremy. I don't know if you heard.
Did you hear that question, Jeremy?
You're going to have to repeat it. I'm sorry.
So the question was that have we looked at and considered the importance of hunting as a source of food for rural communities, rural residents?
I guess I'm not certain
For
why.
poorer residents.
Yeah, I guess.
I'm assuming the commissions are typically.
Oh, good.
So, yeah, just the broader issue of social class and economic class. I'm assuming that the game commissions are typically higher income individuals. But I'm wondering if anybody's looked at that.
Yeah, I think the short answer is no. Nobody's looked at that directly. We weren't able to discern that from the class of individuals from the existing publicly available data. But my assumption would be similar to yours, that that they're going to come mostly from higher class or higher education, higher income people that have some sort of influence, and that's how they've gotten themselves on the commission to begin with.
Yeah, just to add that, I forget, I think it was you, Michelle, that, talked about the importance of commissions, or no, Dawn did, about the importance of commissions for patronage. It's a way for governors to reward their campaign donors. So those people tend to have more money.
Other questions? Here you go.
Thank you. So my question is whether you think this change needs to be, based on like a public push or more like from wildlife advocacy groups? And if you think that the public can play a big role in it, so do we have any data what public thinks about these issues or not?
Well, I'll take a stab at answering that first. Our institutions aren't democratic enough, so that's why we're seeing that gap. So the public is on our side, by and large, on lots of these issues, but the decision makers don't listen. So if you have a lack of democracy in the whole process, then it's really hard to even, get out the vote or, have the public, organize them into a large outcry, which we do, and it falls on deaf ears often. So that's a part of the issue. But my answer is always both. So it should be the public, it should be advocacy organizations, it should be anyone and everyone in a position of power that can raise their voice to talk about these things. So I think it has to be everybody. Does anybody else want to chime in on that?
I can chime in and say hello to Ben. I'm pretty sure I recognize his voice. And just that, I think my colleagues like to remind me that, they like to assume that if we take hunters or we reduce the role of hunters in the decision-making processes, that we're going to have tyranny of the minority. And my response to them is to say, well, currently we have tyranny of the majority, and currently we have tyranny of the minority. And so I don't see tyranny of the majority as actually moving in any way in a negative direction, right? Like that's moving us appreciably towards a more democratic position. And so I guess I only see that as being a good thing.
I do have one comment. I should have done a disclosure. I don't regard all hunters the same. The hunters that show up at Wildlife Commission meetings are the noisiest ones. They're the most hardcore. They're the ones who drive the system. In this state, we have, like I said, 70,000 resident hunting license. I've never seen 70,000 hunters in one room at the same time. I've never seen 700. I haven't seen 70. So what happens in front of a wildlife commission is that the hardcore folk, the true believers, the ones who really are dedicated, show up and push their perspective. And of course, we do the same. So I don't want to paint all hunters with the same brush, because that is absolutely untrue. But what is true is that hunters are way ahead of us in terms of decades of organization. Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Bighorns Unlimited, Mule Deer Foundation. We are way behind the curve in getting organized. But you know what's happened? A couple of things. One is the internet, 2, social media, 3, digital photography. And wow, has the public begun to catch up in a hurry. It used to be in my early days when I was out looking for trap lines to take photographs. It'd take me a week, and trap lines are hard to find in Nevada and so on. Now, the trappers do it for us. We just go on the internet and take off the photographs we want. I mean, it's quite crazy what's happening. And to me, it's an exponential change in the direction of public awareness versus the traditional message that most legislators and decision makers have. They've drunk the Kool-Aid for a long time. We have an educational problem to surmount, but it's happening, and I do not wish to claim all hunters are the same. They're absolutely not. There are many ethical hunters who are on our side, almost, including coyote killing. They hate coyote killing. They hate trapping. Most hunters don't like trapping. So I just want to make sure I wasn't misunderstood with respect to that.
I think we've got a question here, and recognizing, I think we're talking into the break, so of course if people want to take a break, no judgment, but I think we can keep talking if people are interested.
I just had a general comment plus kind of one kind of question follow-up. As kind of a consumptive user, I am a hunter and fisher out of Arizona. I've kind of dealt with game and fish from top to bottom with officers. Now I work with Maricopa County DOT. I deal also with their non-game branch regularly as far as management, dealing with our projects. And I said, I hold them in high regard, dealing with their management practices, top to bottom, dealing with their officers on the hunting side, fishing side. But then also, I was just kind of curious, has there been any research as far as agencies across the nation, as far as, is there dedicated non-game branches? Game and Fish has one of the best in the country. As far as having a dedicated non-game branch, I deal with their bat biologists, I deal with their non-game regarding culvert crossings and camera traps and things like that for coyotes, for predators, that looking at novel ways to prevent vehicle impacts, and that's kind of where I associate with them, especially on the bat side. And I was just kind of seeing if there's been any research done across the country for other departments that have dedicated budgets for non-game species.
Well, let me answer it slightly differently. From my point of view, our Department of Wildlife here in Nevada does amazing things that most of the public never hears about. The only time that we hear about the incredible stuff from, fencing off bat caves to tortoise preservation, to all this stuff, is when the director of the agency gives his report to the commission. Then we hear about all these things that never make the news. What does make the news are mostly what the commission does, not the department. And from my point of view, it's the commission that represents our biggest obstacles in terms of philosophy. And in this state, the commission essentially has veto power over what the department does. So I have no heartburn with the department, generally speaking. It's the commission from my point of view, and I recognize the incredible work that the department does generally. Jeremy?
I'd just echo the sentiments. My experience with the rank and file agency folks has been, they're really good. I don't know of any systematic research that looks at, or that looks to see if there are non-game wings of every agency. At least all that I'm familiar with at least have some sort of non-game specialist, usually multiple people, depending on the taxonomy that they're. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know of any systematic evaluation that's looked at that.
I think it probably depends a lot on funding sources. Arizona's got a diversified funding base for the agency. New Mexico does not. 99% of the Game and Fish Department in New Mexico their money comes from Pittman Robertson, Dingle Johnson, and license sales, 99%. And that's mostly going towards hunting, fishing, and game species. But we have a very small non-game staff. I think maybe 2 people.
We got a question over here.
Hi. So thank you all for your presentations. It was really enlightening. And I just had wanted to ask all your opinions on just generally. So I work on hybridization with cutthroat trout and rainbow trout. Closely with NDOW, and a lot of my manager partners at NDOW, they're telling me that they're charged with stocking brook trout, or like 7,000 brook trout went into one of the LCT creeks that I work on like 2 weeks ago, and rainbow trout. So what are things that I could do tangibly in working with these NDOW or other partners that could be an actionable step?
Go ahead, Michelle.
Oh, okay. That's a tough one. I mean, do you feel comfortable having conversations about changing policy? Because I know that's a challenge in so many places, is that even agency staff are on board with changing the status quo, and they don't feel comfortable or safe in their positions to do so. And so that's where we see fisheries and wildlife students not staying in those careers because they don't see their values reflected in those agencies. So easy for me to tell you to be brave and have those conversations with people, because I think just saying it, just starting to ask those questions, just saying, what about these other values? What about these other potential management decisions that we could be making? I think would be a huge first step, but easier said than done, right? It's a huge system. It needs systematic change. Exactly. Yeah, and there's no easy answer to that right now. I don't know if other folks have. Okay, another question. I also just want to say, shout out to Dr. Chris Serenary. He's got a late breaking session very related to this topic. When's your session? Tomorrow morning. So look for that.
Thank you. I guess I just have a comment going off of what you had to say. These meetings, the commission meetings, and all kinds of other meetings that are held by the state wildlife agencies are public meetings. You are fully able to go and participate. There will be public comment periods where you can share your thoughts. And I think, frankly, people who are studying the species or people who are already engaged in the space, especially from a conservation side of things, should really look into attending these meetings. It's a great opportunity to share your voice. And frankly, it's a voice that's not always represented. These public meetings have to be publicly announced. And a lot of the time, you can find them on the website of the agency. I just wanted to share another comment that I think that we need to avoid creating an us versus them argument, because obviously we're living in an incredibly polarized time where everybody is on the opposite side of an issue, and there's not much of a gradient in between. So I think that trying to reach out to people on a human level, like maybe take a hunter's ed class, or try fishing, or if you know a hunter, take them out with you birding, take them to go look at pollinators, try to bring people from way at the ends to the middle. I think that on a human level, we can all do that and seek out trying those things as well.
I used to bring donuts to the commission meeting. It never got me anywhere. But I'm joking. But your comment is well taken. And I forgot to mention one thing here in Nevada. It may be true in other states as well, that one of the problems in a more productive interaction between those of us who do not sit on the Wildlife Commission and but have as much of an interest in wildlife as any of them is the open meeting law here in this state. And I have 3 minutes to make one comment on a complicated agenda item. The commissioners and the people they appoint on their subcommittees, who are never one of us, can go on for hours. There is no way to have some sort of a complex discussion about complex issues, as we've been talking about today in Nevada, partly because of the open meeting law. And the commission has not come up with a way, despite some interest in figuring out how, without violating the open meeting law, we can sit in a room like this and go on for an hour or two about coyote killing contests, for example, or trapping abuse, or mountain lion management. It can't happen because of the open meeting law, which is nuts. The open meeting law presumably is there to provide public input when in fact it curtails it. And so while in sentiment I fully agree with you, the mechanics are not yet developed to allow what you're talking about. It's crazy. You wouldn't think that, but it's true. Nuts. It's nuts. I don't know. Is that true in New Mexico? Open meeting law inhibits discussion?
Well, the commission only allows 3 minutes or 2 minutes per person to speak. And then it's weird because the commission will not respond to questions. So you can't have a dialogue. You can't have a back and forth. So it's kind of a performative type meeting, and you're right. It's really hard to get a different perspective in there. One more question? Okay.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm just wondering, states obviously don't exist in geographic isolation, even though there's a lot of power at the state level for all this stuff that's been talked about. So I'm curious how much, are there good examples of states that coordinate with other states around them in terms of their management of species, or just any kind of discussion on across state management of fish and game?
I'm not an expert. I'm sure for game species or maybe even endangered species, there is considerable cross-state cooperation. So the rainbow trout, the states talk to each other about where to get the rainbow trout. And they'll buy rainbow trout or other fish that they want to stock. If they don't have them, they'll buy them from other states. You know, we got our, I know that, you know, the states talk to each other about where to get, and if they want to reintroduce certain game species like bighorns or pronghorn, they will work with other states to get those. But again, I'm not the expert on that. Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. I apologize for the technical difficulties, and but appreciate your patience, and we should probably go to the break. Thanks. Thanks, Jeremy.
You bet. It's good to see you all.